Hello. As part of Book Week, I'm going to share a story with you. The story is going to be in three parts, and all of those instalments will be available on our school Facebook page and on the website. So, this is the first part. This is part one of the story. And the story I'm going to read to you is called The Curse of Cogston House. Sounds very scary. The Curse of Cogston House, Part 1. Jack strode up to an overgrown path away from the park, as though relishing a mission through the jungle, dodging the occasional stinging nettle with an effortless skip or a jump. "Come on, Luca, this is gonna be epic." Dipping his head and swiping away leaves like some intrepid explorer, he manoeuvred under a tree branch which hung over the narrow track. Luca dawdled behind. Only a few minutes earlier he had been perfectly happy practicing his limited gymnastic moves upside down on the monkey bars. Now he was torn between making the effort to keep up with his friend and deliberately getting left behind. "Speed up! We're nearly there!" Jack called eagerly over his shoulder. Luca wasn't at all sure that they should be leaving the park swings where they had been allowed to hang out without their parents, since both recently celebrated their 11th birthday in the same week. He is even less sure that he wanted to be venturing towards the top end, as everyone called that part of the park. He spun round to look behind him. The monkey bars were now way out of sight, and the watery evening sun above was being muscled out of position by an ever-darkening shades of grey, layering over each other in the sky like a collage. "And maybe it's getting a bit too late for today," Luca suggested hopefully. He looked down towards his watch, scowling at the time. 10:31. He shook his wrist vigorously. Clearly the watch had stopped working, as it was only just beginning to get dark. He's going to need a new excuse. "We could come back tomorrow when it's lighter. I think it's going to rain from the look of those clouds. And Dad's making bolognese for tea. We don't want to miss that." Being 2 days older than his friend clearly gave him no superiority whatsoever. "Forget about your stomach for a minute. I can see the scaffolding through this gap," enthused Jack, trampling undeterred over the thorny undergrowth. Luca followed him unhappily along the gradual dwindling path. Hands up in front of himself and elbows tucked in, he was now having to place his trainers precisely onto prickly stems to pin them down with his soles and avoid any contact with his bare arms or legs. On the other side of a tangled row of bushes, the broken-looking building loomed. 50-foot-high scaffolding encased the crumbling walls of Cogston House, like a rusty exoskeleton. The long metal poles, bolted together at regular right angles, seemed as though they were keeping the whole house from falling apart. About 100 years ago, the house had apparently been quite grand, belonging to a rich family who owned the entire park. Until about 30 years ago, it had been inhabited, but for decades now it had wasted away, shedding scraps of brickwork and hiding itself under a cloak of creeping ivy. Even from the outside, it had a look of being infested with sadness. Everyone had a story about Cogston House. No one knew what was true and what was rumour, and Luca didn't want to stick around to find out. "Ow!" he squealed, as Jack reached back and hauled him through the gap he had just made in the twisting greenery. Luca rubbed at a fresh pale scratch on his arm. Unconcerned, Jack stood triumphantly, his hands on his hips, admiring the enormous house. His eyes swept the building as if they belonged to an ancient explorer who had just discovered a long-forgotten corner of the world. "Told you it would be epic," Jack grinned. "Epic? Looked like it's barely standing up," replied Luca. At home, Luca had heard his stepmum say that it was about time Cogston House was renovated, and that it would be good for the area if it was properly restored, with access opened up again. In reply, his dad had said that it would be better to take a wrecking ball to it, after everything that had gone on there. Luca didn't know exactly what had gone on there meant, but he now regretted mentioning the place at all to Jack. The house had always been there as long as both boys could remember, but it was just somewhere that they'd never visited. Of course it had been Jack's idea to go and investigate after Luca had brought it up that day at the swings. No doubt Jack would know some story about the place, and if he didn't, he'd be making one up anyway. "Have you heard the story of what happened to those two girls here?" Right on cue, thought Luca. Here comes the story. "I heard it from my cousin next door," Jack went on. "Her mum knew one of the girls from school years ago, and her grandad worked in the factory that the Cogston family owned." "What are you going on about?" Luca asked, with a shake of his head, distracted by pulling furry goosegrass buds from his shoulders. Before an answer came, the crack of snapping wood grabbed Luca's attention, and he looked up, eyes widening, to see Jack grinning back at him from a narrow doorway at the side of the house. The splintered length of rotten wood in his hand matched a large panel daubed with graffiti, which hung limply at an angle where a proper door should have been. "Come through here, and I'll tell you," said Jack. I really don't think we should be doing that," Luca responded, looking around in search of any signs of life. He flicked a creepy crawly from his arm, and his finger rubbed manically at a telltale tickle in his hand, which suggested that maybe more critters were making a new home in his hair. By the time that he dealt with them, Jack's feet were just disappearing after the rest of his body inside the building. A few raindrops were released from the bulging grey clouds. Inside Luca's head, a slow drumbeat was gathering momentum, and a voice was screaming at him to turn around, yet his dry mouth barely let out a murmur in protest. Inwardly, he wished that an invisible force field would propel him backwards from the narrow opening in the doorway, but instead he swallowed hard and copied Jack's crouching motion to squeeze through the broken door frame. Standing upright, again inside, Luca looked around. The first thing that he noticed was the stale air, which seeped into his mouth and nostrils. Repulsed by the mouldy stench that hung in the atmosphere, he focused on inhaling through the tiniest slit in his mouth to avoid breathing it in any more than he had to. Beneath his feet, loose rubble covered the floor, like that of a building site, and dry leaves nestled together in dirty piles and crunched when he trod on them. It was as though the outside had crept inside. Huge rugs were spaced along the hallway, not laid flat or neatly as they once would have been. They were ruffled, folded, damp-smelling and thick with dirt. Luca shuddered at the thought of how many tiny creatures were camping out amongst the threadbare fibres. Looking up, Luca noted that every single window was cracked or broken. Spindly branches of a tree scratched and tapped at one high window, and lower a cool breeze whistled through the jagged hole, causing him to shiver. The hallway was darker than he'd have liked. A lampshade dangled from the ceiling at a crooked angle, but there was no bulb in it. Instead, some light forced its way through the many dirty windows. Some found an easier passage through small holes in the walls and the roof. Dust particles floated in the still air, and there was just enough light to allow the boys to see the shape of the hallway and the decrepit furniture. All around them, items from the house's former life still remained. Huge pictures in decorative frames hung on the walls, portraits of miserable old men which seemed to have been painted in shades of only brown and beige. Although Luca could see the shadowy outlines of doorways leading off from the hallway, the darkness swallowed up any objects which lay further down the corridor. "Whoa! Look! A winding staircase!" Jack gasped, moving forwards through the darkness. His voice rang through the house like a siren. "Well, what about it?" whispered Luca, gazing toward the blackness at the end of the hallway. The skeletal remains of a chair sat solemnly in the corner, spilling springy insides out from amidst its rotten frame. Its back was loosely attached to the rest of its body, and one splintered leg splayed out in an awkward fashion. "Well, it's just like in the story." "I still don't know what story you're going on about." Luca took short, ginger steps forwards until he was close enough to Jack to see him clearly in the dim light. Jack was running his hand, fascinated, along the weathered wooden panels of an enormous staircase which wound grandly up to yet more darkness above. As he turned back towards Luca, he began to recount the tale. And in part 2, you can find out what happened to two girls who visited Cogston Hall. That's the tale that Jack wants to tell. Catch you in part 2.